Hey everyone, okay, so we've spent the last few days getting to grips with H1Z1 on PlayStation 4 and PS4 Pro. And, well, just from this initial few seconds of footage, you've probably got a handle on what this new beta release is offering. A very PUBG-like experience, but this time for Sony consoles. And it's actually quite shocking just how close it is. There's the same lobby area where players amass before the battle royale begins. There's the same parachute descent down to a vast map. There's the same foraging for weapons and equipment. The same use of vehicles for quick traversal across the terrain. The same ever-constricting map, and similar very tense encounters until just one player or team is left standing. And yeah, even the visual style is highly reminiscent of the PlayerUnknown epic. And none of this is particularly surprising, of course. H1Z1 on PC actually released before PUBG, and PlayerUnknown himself, Brendan Green, was involved with both games. However, there are a few very important differences. The state of the engine technology, performance levels, and basic accessibility. The first one is rather important actually, as it's clear that even pared back compared to its PC release, PUBG on Xbox One is using a far more sophisticated renderer than H1Z1 on PS4. Now, there are vast differences in the visual feature set and resolution, but the point is that shooters feel better at a higher frame rate, and H1Z1 is targeting 60 frames per second, double the peak frame rate of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Now, performance is still something of a sticking point on PUBG, and it's far from a perfect 60 FPS on H1Z1, but the fact is that in terms of input latency and controller response, it's a transformative experience, and you do feel more in control of the gunplay on the new game. But clearly the visual trades here might be just a bit too much for some. Now let's return to the second point I mentioned, accessibility. PUBG has a detailed inventory system and customization mechanic. Now this is gone in H1Z1, giving you just a simple radial dial for selecting weapons. Now, adapting those guns with custom sights, magazines and whatnot, yeah, that's not happening here. Every weapon has a standard configuration and you're left to get on with the action instead. Oh, and something else that H1Z1 has going for it, a focus on cutting down on the more tedious aspects of the PUBG experience. Now let's begin with the perennial boredom I experience in tracking down a vehicle. You can spend tons of time scouring the landscape looking for a car in PUBG. It's obviously more realistic, of course, but in H1Z1 they're highlighted on the map for you, making it much easier to navigate and to get about. Secondly, there's the fact that a potential PUBG game could be simply 20 minutes of walking about, seeing nobody before being sniped from afar. Now, some might say this is a kind of core part of the experience. I mean, you never know what's going to happen from one game to the next. However, H1Z1 not only highlights vehicles, but it also includes points of interest on the map. Now, in my experience, this mechanic naturally attracts players to specific points in the play area, leading to more encounters in more interesting areas. And on top of that, weapons drops are also highlighted on the map, again bringing players together more frequently with more intensity in the encounters as everyone competes for those higher end weapons and equipment upgrades. Another tick in the accessibility box is the combat training mode. It's a smaller map with a decent amount of players, but it does have a respawn mechanic. Effectively, it's battle royale gameplay with a deathmatch slant. You're still hunting down kit, driving vehicles and gunning down opponents, but it gets you into the thick of the action more quickly and allows you to get to grips with H1Z1's combat very easily. Now, there are no scores here, and aside from losing looted weapons, there's no real penalty for dying. It's just pretty awesome actually, just to dip in and to see how well the gunplay holds up. So we are Digital Foundry, so let's talk technology then. H1Z1 is powered by the Forge Light engine, bespoke to the developer, Daybreak Game Company. It's been used in the team's previous titles, and there is some console lineage here with PlanetSide 2 previously appearing on PS4. we can assume it's built from the ground up for handling a ton of concurrent players, an aspect that has clearly caused PUBG some issues in its Xbox form. But well, how can I put it? There are some nice bloom effects, some nice lighting effects in some restricted areas, but let's be honest, H1Z1 isn't exactly a current gen looker. Part of the issue is a low rendering resolution paired with rather selective anti-aliasing. So check this out and you can see this kind of weird moire pattern here as we pan from left to right. Not great. Now, there may be a pass of post-process anti-aliasing here, but it's not particularly effective on standard geometry. But at the very least, foliage, transparent textures are handled pretty well with little to no shimmer. And speaking of rendering resolutions, we're looking at just 1080p on PlayStation 4 Pro, which delivers a 31% boost to pixel count over the PS4 Amateur, which we count at a slightly strange 1656 by 954. So yeah, you can see now why comparisons with PUBG on Xbox aren't really fair. That game's 1080p on a standard Xbox and full native 4K on the X. Clearly the emphasis here is on performance over prettiness, and that might explain why the game can look so barren. And yeah, just like PUBG, those building interiors in particular can look pretty bad. There's a definite lack of both incidental detail and a kind of emphasis on very flat shading here, with a particular lack of effective indirect lighting that makes it all look rather basic. So, if the sense is of a stripped back experience on a decidedly non-AAA engine, just what kind of performance are we actually getting here? So, to measure this, we played H1Z1 with 2 players in a single multiplayer server, myself on PS4 Pro and Tom Morgan on the base PS4. Now the aim here is to ensure a level playing ground between the 2 systems. And as we dip into the lobby, there's a clear divide in terms of performance, with the Pro offering a ballpark 10 frames per second advantage. And yeah, as the initial parachute descent begins, it's clear that the PS4 Pro has a significant advantage. We're already dropping frames on base, while Sony's so-called supercharged console powers ahead. Even in interior scenes, the base system can't hold 60 frames per second, though there are some curious blips pro side here when the other player is visible, which is kinda odd. Outside, with both players looking in the same direction with just a small shift in viewpoint, you can see the gap when both systems are dropping frames. So in this scene at least, the Pro isn't just delivering a 31% increase in resolution, but an additional boost to performance that's also in the region of 30%. Let's move now into combat, where our team is engaged in a firefight. An interesting series of parallel lines here between the 2 systems. And also intriguing is how both systems get a 50 millisecond frame time stutter when the opponent is taken down. Starting off another game here, there's the customary 10 frames per second gap between the 2 systems, and also indications that alpha fog effects can have an impact on sub-pixel detail here, as shown by the power lines, which have a lot of breakup. As we move closer, the effect gets progressively uglier, more so on the base system with its reduced rendering resolution. For our next tests, we moved into a forest area of the map to see how the engine copes with a type of environmental effects that can often tank performance. Truth is though, H1Z1 actually holds up rather well. There's an element of smoke and mirrors here in that the developer is using actual foliage that blends in well with detailed ground textures that are actually flat. The overall look though blends pretty well, and performance here, even on the base system, is very good. 50 frames per second or thereabouts, but again with a 10 frames per second advantage for the Pro. However, when the game really goes heavy on transparent alpha texture effects, like using a smoke grenade for example, as you can see here, frame rate tanks on both systems. Typically, this kind of workload has more of a profound impact on memory bandwidth rather than GPU compute. And let's remember that PS4 Pro's memory bandwidth upgrade over the base system is pretty minimal. That said, it's interesting to note here that the 10 FPS divide between 2 systems remains in effect even under the worst one-sided stress test. So let's look at that head-to-head then. After all, in PUBG there was a clear graphical boost for Xbox One X users, leaving the standard console often looking a little threadbare by comparison. Truth is, we're looking at a much more level playing field here. Perhaps not surprising, bearing in mind the ballpark 10 frames per second lead combined with a 30% boost to pixel count. Textures are of the same quality, anisotropic filtering is the same, shadow quality is a match, and foliage density and placement is also very much the same. Now there can be some differences in far off detail though, specifically in how the skybox is rendered, and very occasionally in distant object detail. This is the biggest difference we saw really, whether it's down to a per client variation in atmospheric rendering or whether this is actually a pro advantage kind of remains to be seen. But that's really all there is to tell on the platform comparison side. It's the same visual feature set effectively, but the big story is to a lesser extent the resolution bump, but more importantly the big leap in frame rate you get on PS4 Pro. So H1Z1 then, it's faster and smoother than PUBG and it's geared towards more instant gratification. Higher levels of performance can certainly help the experience for PS4 Pro users, but it's in a kind of 40 to 45 FPS no man's land for the most part on the standard system, which doesn't feel particularly great. For owners of the enhanced console though, it's quite fun actually, and I particularly like the combat training mode, which could be spun into a more action-orientated game mode as opposed to the no stakes anything goes shootout it is now. And of course, H1Z1 is free, meaning that you've got nothing to lose just by downloading it and giving it a shot. Okay, so I'm going to sign off for now. As usual, please do like and subscribe, and yes, if you're already subbed, ring the bell to ensure you're notified as soon as a new DF video drops. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.